Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis,
Right.
there is this deeply ingrained expectation of precision.
Right, like it's a science.
Exactly. It feels like engineering. You
Hmm.
fall off your bike, you break your arm, and the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen,
Yeah.
and the doctor just points to it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
It's a completely binary state. I mean, it's either broken or it's not broken.
Right. It's clean.
Yeah.
And I think more importantly, it's comforting. We are just biologically wired to things that are visible, quantifiable, and easily categorized into neat little boxes.
Oh, absolutely. It gives us a sense of control over all the chaotic elements of life. If we can name it and see it, we feel like we can supposedly fix it.
But then you take a step back and you look at the broader world. You look at global geopolitics, macroeconomics, the actual structural ways that different societies are managed. And suddenly you realize that this global X-ray machine we use is fundamentally broken. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, it's incredibly murky.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
Right, because we rely so heavily on these everyday labels. We throw around words like capitalism, communism, democracy, autocracy.
Like they're perfectly defined buckets.
Exactly. And reading through the massive stack of materials we have for today's deep dive, I had this really sinking realization that these labels actually act more like blindfolds than lenses.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And the real danger here is that if we keep relying on those old, Cold War era X-ray machines to interpret modern global movements, we are going to completely misdiagnose the trajectory of the entire global order.
We're basically trying to use a 20th century dictionary to read a 21st century reality.
Exactly. We end up trying to force incredibly complex, sometimes ancient systems into a 250-year-old Western vocabulary, and it just doesn't apply to them.
Which is exactly why we're here today. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today's mission is highly ambitious.
Very ambitious.
We are aiming to completely rip off the Band-Aid on how the world actually operates beneath the relentless daily churn of the 24-hour news cycle. We've got a massive stack of sources today.
Yeah, we're covering a lot of ground.
We really are. We are pulling from deep historical texts on ancient Chinese societal hierarchies, economic critiques on the true nature of modern financial austerity from people like Claire Matta, all the way to contemporary geopolitical strategy papers written by actual ideological architects in Beijing and Moscow.
It's a heavy stack.
It is. And our goal for you listening today is to figure out why that global X-ray machine isn't working and what is actually driving these major superpowers toward what really looks like an inevitable structural collision.
But before we get into the mechanisms of that collision, we really need to establish a clear baseline for how we're going to approach this material today.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Because the sources we're exploring unpack highly politically charged global structures. I mean, they critique the West, they analyze the East, and they touch on systems of governance that evoke very strong emotional responses.
Absolutely.
So our objective here is total analytical impartiality. We are not here to endorse any specific system. Not left-wing, not right-wing, not the Western model, nor the Eastern model.
We're basically acting as architects examining blueprints, right?
That's exactly it. You want to map the structural DNA that dictates modern geopolitical survival. We're strictly looking at how these societies function, why they evolved the way they did, and, how they perceive each other's vulnerabilities.
I think that is a really crucial disclaimer because I have to admit, reading through some of these geopolitical essays this week, I found myself experiencing some pretty profound skepticism about the long-term mathematical stability of our own Western financial system.
It's definitely a sobering read.
It really is.
Yeah.
These authors are painting a picture that is fundamentally different from what you hear on a standard financial news network. So if we want to understand what alternative global models are reacting against, we need to first put our own operating system under the microscope.
Right. We have to look at ourselves first.
So according to the analyses in these papers, how do these foreign strategic thinkers actually categorize the modern Western state?
It is a fascinating diagnosis. The consensus among these external strategists is that throughout the 20th century, the West was entirely focused on the threat of George Orwell's 1984.
Okay, the classic totalitarian nightmare.
Exactly. We feared a world of pure, brutal, top-down totalitarianism, a world defined entirely by physical coercion. But what these analyses suggest is that what the West actually developed in the 21st century is this highly sophisticated hybrid system.
A hybrid of what?
It's the underlying control mechanisms of Orwell's 1984, but it's perfectly wrapped inside the comfortable, pleasure-seeking, voluntary distractions of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that sounds like a very dramatic dystopian pitch, and I want to challenge that right out of the gate.
Go for it.
Let's start with the Orwellian side, right? The stick. When I think of Orwell, I think of structural, literal surveillance. I think of the telescreen bolted to the wall in your living room where the state watches your every move and punishes you for stepping out of line.
Right, the classic Big Brother image.
Exactly. But we obviously don't have government agents installing cameras in our bedrooms. So how are these essays arguing that we live in an Orwellian surveillance state?
Well, the argument is that the mechanism of surveillance didn't disappear. It was simply privatized, and it was made frictionless.
Frictionless, how so?
Think about it. We don't have a state-mandated telescreen because we voluntarily purchased the telescreen. We upgrade it every 2 years, and we willingly carry it in our pockets everywhere we go.
You're talking about smartphones.
Exactly. The structural surveillance manifests as surveillance capitalism. You are carrying a device equipped with GPS, accelerometers, and high-definition microphones.
And we pay for the privilege.
We do. You accept digital cookies that track your browsing habits across the entire web. You install smart home devices that map the literal floor plan of your house and record ambient audio.
Wow, when you put it like that.
Right. Private data brokers are continuously harvesting incredibly granular details about your behavioral patterns, your location history, and your financial transactions.
But that's corporate data collection. That's not the state. The state doesn't have to build a massive, clunky bureaucracy to gather that intel.
Exactly, and that's the genius of it. The essays point out that in many Western jurisdictions, the state frequently circumvents traditional constitutional boundaries.
Like the Fourth Amendment in the U.S., which protects against unreasonable search and seizure.
Precisely. They circumvent it simply by purchasing that processed packaged data directly from the private sector. The surveillance is ubiquitous, but it feels completely benign because it's administered by consumer tech companies rather than, men in trench coats.
Okay, that covers the surveillance. But what about the narrative control aspect? Orwell famously wrote about newspeak, right? The idea of deliberately eliminating words from the dictionary to make heretical thoughts impossible to even conceptualize.
Right.
Again, we don't have government censors burning dictionaries in the public square.
We don't. But the texts argue we have developed algorithmic newspeak.
Algorithmic news.
Yes. It operates completely invisibly at the platform level. It's not an overt public ban. It's algorithmic demotion, often referred to as shadow banning.
Ah, okay. So it's about reach, not removal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When a few centralized tech platforms control the primary public square, shifting corporate guidelines can narrow the boundaries of acceptable public discourse almost overnight.
So they don't erase the heretical post,
They simply tweak the algorithm so that the post has a reach of absolute zero. The speaker thinks they're shouting from the rooftops when in reality they've been digitally quarantined in a soundproof room.
That is terrifying, because you don't even know you've been silenced.
Right. Furthermore, Orwell wrote about the 2 minutes hate, where public anger was deliberately directed toward internal scapegoats to keep the population unified through fear.
Right, a designated target for all the societal rage.
Well, modern algorithms are mathematically optimized to prioritize outrage. They effectively monetize polarization, keeping the population perpetually angry at each other over cultural wedge issues, rather than examining the structural economic architecture around them.
Which brings us to the Huxleyan side of the equation, because, if a population is constantly surveilled and kept in a state of manufactured algorithmic outrage, eventually they are going to snap.
Human psychology can only take so much pressure.
Right. The Orwellian stick only works long-term if the population is somehow anesthetized to the pain of it. And that is where Brave New World comes in.
Precisely. Huxley understood that a softer tyranny is significantly more insidious and durable than a brutal one.
Because you don't fight against what you enjoy.
Exactly. In Brave New World, the state doesn't need secret police because the citizens voluntarily take a pharmaceutical drug called soma to escape any complex, negative, or politically disruptive emotion. They are controlled by pleasure, not pain.
So what's our modern equivalent?
The geopolitical analyses we're reviewing describe our modern equivalent as digital soma.
Digital soma. Let's really break down the mechanics of that, because this isn't just about people liking their phones. The sources get into the actual literal neurology of this interface.
They do, and it's quite stark. Think about the infinite scroll interface on your social media feeds, the short-form video platforms, the heavily gamified mobile apps.
Yeah.
These platforms are not designed for utility. They are engineered using variable reward schedules.
Wait, isn't that the exact same behavioral psychology mechanism used in casino slot machines?
It is the exact same mechanism. When you pull down to refresh your feed, you don't know what you're going to get. It might be boring, or it might be a highly engaging video that triggers a micro-release of dopamine.
So you're constantly pulling the lever.
Yeah, exactly. This continuous high-frequency stimulation loop fundamentally alters brain chemistry over time.
It actively erodes the cognitive capacity for deep, sustained critical thought.
It does. When your brain is completely accustomed to receiving a new stimulus every 15 seconds, sitting down to read a dense 400-page book on economic policy becomes physically uncomfortable.
I feel that. We all feel that.
And more importantly, according to these essays, this hyper-connected environment actively pathologizes solitude.
Okay, what does that mean? Pathologizes solitude.
Well, in Huxley's world state, citizens were discouraged from ever being alone because silence and solitude naturally lead to introspection. And introspection leads to questioning the system.
That is a staggering observation. I mean, think about your normal day. Think about it. If you have 30 seconds of unexpected downtime, you're standing in an elevator or waiting in line for coffee, what is your automatic reflex?
You pull out your phone.
You pull out your phone. We have engineered a modern world that is structurally hostile to unstructured boredom. But boredom is the exact cognitive space where independent processing, original thought, and political awakening actually happen.
If you are never bored, you are never truly evaluating your own condition. You're just reacting.
And the final pillar of this Huxleyan model.
It's hyperconsumerism framed as civic duty and personal identity. People are conditioned to believe that their political agency and their individual uniqueness are expressed strictly through their purchasing choices.
Like the brands they wear or the specific aesthetic they consume.
Exactly. So when you synthesize these two frameworks, the analysts argue that the West has created an incredibly effective, localized matrix of control.
But wait, here is where I really have to push back on these sources. Because there is a massive contradiction here.
Let's hear it.
We are talking about hyperconsumerism and digital distraction. But the economic data in these very same sources points to a deeply precarious working class. They talk extensively about the K-shaped economy, where a tiny sliver of the population sees massive wealth accumulation, while the vast majority are on a relentless downward trajectory.
That's right.
So how can you have a control matrix built on consumer pleasure if the consumers are broke?
That is the dark genius and ultimately the fatal fragility of the entire synthesis. The control matrix actually relies heavily on financial precarity.
Really? How?
The population is deliberately kept on a debt treadmill. You have crushing student loans, high-interest consumer credit, astronomical mortgages, or constantly rising rents.
Right.
That precarity acts as the invisible Orwellian stick. You are simply too financially anxious and too deeply dependent on your next paycheck to ever risk engaging in any form of systemic dissent or a prolonged labor strike.
You can't afford to rebel.
Exactly. You are trapped by the strict math of your own survival. But to keep you from despairing and completely rebelling against that trap, the system feeds you the Huxleyan carrot.
The digital soma.
Yes, the endless, cheap digital dopamine loop that dilutes your critical attention just enough to get you through to the next day.
Okay, that is a terrifying analogy. It's essentially like being trapped in a massive, sprawling casino where hidden cameras track your every heartbeat and algorithmically adjust the environment to keep you playing.
That's the 1984 surveillance side.
Right. But the drinks are free, the lights are flashing, and the slot machines are so hypnotizing that you completely forget you don't even own the shirt on your back.
And that's the Brave New World distraction.
But looking at the mechanics of this, my immediate question is, how on earth is this mathematically sustainable? It feels like a massive pressure cooker. I mean, you can't keep people pacified with digital videos forever if the physical reality around them is literally decaying.
You have hit on the exact structural vulnerability that foreign strategists are watching intensely.
So they see this breaking.
Oh, absolutely. Political scientists within the West might label this system as stable because it effectively prevents organized, violent, internal rebellion. But from a purely mathematical standpoint, it is a ticking clock.
Because the math doesn't lie.
Right. The hybrid dystopia is entirely reliant on the assumption that the baseline physical needs of the population can still be met. When the underlying math breaks, the distraction mechanism fails and the entire system unravels.
So let's look at exactly how that math is breaking. Because according to the texts, the horizon of collapse is accelerating rapidly, and it starts with the macroeconomic engine of this whole system.
It does.
Let's look at the Orwellian side of the ledger first, the perpetual war economy. Now, in the original novel 1984, Orwell describes three global superstates that are perpetually at war with each other.
Right. Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia.
Exactly. But the crucial detail is that they aren't fighting to conquer territory or achieve actual victory. The war is a deliberate economic tool designed to burn up surplus wealth. It destroys industrial output so that the masses remain impoverished, ignorant, and entirely dependent on the state.
It is a method of controlled destruction. Now, to be clear, these geopolitical sources are not suggesting that modern Western defense spending is some conscious, smoky backroom conspiracy to impoverish the public in the exact, literal sense Orwell described.
Right, they aren't saying it's a villainous plot.
Exactly. However, they argue the functional outcome is mathematically identical. The modern equivalent of this dynamic is the relentless, staggering expansion of sovereign debt to fund an endlessly expanding global geopolitical posture.
And the numbers are just terrifying.
They really are. The United States, for example, is not operating on a balanced budget. It is operating on a compounding national debt that is currently hovering around $38.9 trillion.
And to put that into perspective, based on the projections we reviewed for this deep dive, the U.S. is going to spend roughly $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026 just to service the interest on that debt.
Just the interest.
Not paying down the principal, not building bridges, not funding healthcare or schools, literally just the interest payments to bondholders.
And this is where we see the fatal mathematical consequence that Orwell's fictional, closed-loop totalitarian state never had to actually contend with.
The inflation.
Exactly. When you weaponize deficit spending to that degree, when you are printing currency, you're issuing debt at a rate that vastly outpaces your actual physical economic growth, you create an inflationary death spiral.
Because the money supply has to expand.
Yes. The central bank is forced to continually expand the money supply to monetize the government's geopolitical overextension, and every new dollar introduced into the system systematically dilutes the purchasing power of the currency already held by the population.
Which acts as a massive, invisible, regressive tax on the working class. And this is exactly the trigger point where the Huxleyan model shatters. We talked about the satiation breaking point.
Right.
The digital soma fails completely when inflation makes physical necessities unaffordable.
Exactly. The distraction matrix only functions if the population is fed, housed, and warm. A 15-second viral dance video on your smartphone provides a fleeting dopamine hit, sure, but it has absolutely zero utility if your rent has doubled, your energy bill is astronomical, and you can't afford groceries for your children.
You cannot live inside a digital screen if you cannot physically heat your home.
You really can't. When the cost of baseline survival outpaces wages, the illusion of the consumer identity dissolves. People realize that participating in the system, working 40 to 60 hours a week, no longer guarantees a dignified baseline existence.
The social contract is fundamentally breached. But the vulnerability isn't just domestic, right? These sources emphasize that the external vulnerabilities are compounding at the exact same time. The West has been able to run this massive deficit engine for decades, primarily because it holds a very unique structural privilege.
The undisputed status of the global fiat reserve currency.
Exactly. For the last half-century, the U.S. dollar has been the foundational bedrock of all global trade.
Yes. Because every other nation needed dollars to buy oil and conduct international commerce, the U.S. could effectively export its inflation.
It's an incredible privilege.
It is. It meant they could print trillions of dollars, and global demand would simply absorb it, keeping domestic prices relatively stable. But the strategic papers from alternative blocs argue that the West has committed a fatal geopolitical error.
They began weaponizing that currency.
Exactly.
By using it as a punitive tool. When the U.S. or the EU doesn't agree with a nation's actions, they don't just send troops anymore. They use the SWIFT system, they enact heavy financial sanctions, and they literally freeze the sovereign central bank reserves of foreign nations.
They weaponized the plumbing of the global financial system.
And while that is, a highly effective short-term tactic, The long-term strategic consequence is that it has terrified the rest of the world.
Oh, absolutely terrified them. It has mathematically forced alternative trading blocs, like the expanded BRICS nations, to aggressively pursue de-dollarization.
They're actively building parallel settlement systems that completely bypass Western financial choke points.
And crucially, they are attempting to back these new systems with tangible physical commodities and gold rather than unbacked fiat paper.
So if the global South and the East successfully transition even a portion of their trade away from the dollar, what actually happens to the U.S. economy?
The mechanism is brutal. If global demand for the dollar drops, all of those trillions of dollars that have been floating around in foreign central banks and international markets are no longer needed.
So they come back.
They come flooding back home to the United States. And when a massive supply of currency suddenly chases a limited domestic supply of goods, you trigger catastrophic, hyper-accelerated domestic inflation.
This is what the analysts refer to as a classic scissor crisis.
Exactly. External overextension meets internal economic hollowization, the two blades of the scissor closing in on the state.
It's like the system gradually loses its capacity to solve its own problems because the primary mechanisms it uses to exert control deficit money printing and digital distraction are the exact same mechanisms accelerating the structural collapse.
It's a vicious cycle that feeds on itself.
Okay, so this brings up a massive, glaring question for me. If this hyper-financialized Western model is inherently fragile, if it is hitting a mathematical wall that foreign observers can clearly see, why did the West adopt this specific architectural blueprint in the first place?
That is the million-dollar question.
And conversely, when ancient sophisticated empires like China or Russia faced similar existential crises in their past, why didn't they take the same path? Why didn't they financialize their states?
To answer that, we really have to transition from diagnosing the present to excavating the past. We have to look at the DNA of this civilizational divergence.
Okay, let's dig into it.
And according to the historical analyses in our stack today, the blueprint of the modern Western state traces its lineage back to a very specific, explosive moment in financial history, the legacy of an 18th century Scottish economist named John Law.
I found this part of the reading absolutely fascinating because I had seen references to John Law before, but I never understood the actual mechanics of what he did and why it became the foundational blueprint for our modern crises. Set the stage for us. What was happening in Europe in 1720?
Well, in the early 18th century, the major European monarchies, specifically England and France, were facing total systemic collapse. They were functionally bankrupt.
Just completely tapped out.
Completely. Decades of relentless imperial warfare had left the French crown drowning in mountains of short-term, high-interest sovereign debt. The traditional mechanisms of taxation were completely exhausted. The peasantry was squeezed dry.
You can't tax a population that has nothing left.
Exactly. The state was on the verge of defaulting, which in those days often meant violent revolution or foreign conquest. Enter John Law. He was a brilliant, highly charismatic Scottish financier and honestly a gambler.
A dangerous combination.
Very. And he somehow managed to gain the ear of the Duke of Orleans, who was acting as the regent of France at the time.
And Law pitches him a solution that seems almost like magic.
It was pure financial alchemy. Law proposed what was essentially the world's first massive state-sponsored debt-to-equity swap.
How did it actually work?
He convinced the French government to allow him to establish a central bank, the Banque Générale, which would issue paper money backed by the state.
Right.
Simultaneously, he took control of the Mississippi Company, which was granted a total monopoly on all future colonial trade and the supposed immense wealth like undiscovered gold in the French territory of Louisiana in North America.
So you have a bank printing paper money and a company promising infinite future wealth in a swamp halfway across the world. How does this solve the king's actual debt problem?
Here is the genius mechanism. Law allowed the citizens of France and the creditors of the state to purchase shares in the Mississippi Company, but they didn't have to use gold or silver.
What did they use?
They could trade in their devalued, high-risk government bonds to buy the company's stock.
Wow. So from the perspective of the French crown, this was a miracle.
An absolute miracle. Their crushing sovereign debt was magically erased from the books, transformed into equity shares of a speculative private company.
And because human nature is what it is, the speculation went completely parabolic.
Oh, completely out of control. Law heavily marketed the supposed riches of Louisiana. The stock price of the Mississippi Company skyrocketed. People from all classes of society were flooding into Paris, specifically a street called the Rue Quincampoix. frantically trading shares, becoming paper millionaires overnight.
Just absolute mania.
It was, and the central bank kept printing more paper money to allow people to buy more stock, creating a massive inflationary feedback loop.
But eventually, the physical reality catches up with the paper alchemy. There was no gold in Louisiana. It was mostly swamps and struggling colonial outposts.
And when the populace finally realized the underlying physical assets did not match the astronomical paper valuation, the Mississippi bubble spectacularly burst in 1720.
Just a total crash.
The panic was absolute. The paper currency became worthless almost overnight. Fortunes were incinerated, and thousands of people were completely financially ruined.
So if it was such an unmitigated disaster for the people, why did these authors claim this is the blueprint for the West? You'd think Europe would have looked at that catastrophe and said, let's never do that again.
You would think so. But here's the catch. Despite the catastrophic collateral damage to the citizens, the state itself survived.
The debt was still gone.
Exactly. The French crown had successfully wiped out its insurmountable war debt. The West learned a permanent foundational lesson from the ashes of 1720. A state can survive imminent bankruptcy by financializing its future.
You don't need to produce tangible wealth today if you can create complex financial instruments that borrow against the anticipated wealth of tomorrow.
Exactly.
And that philosophy didn't just stay isolated in Europe. One of the readings explicitly draws a direct line from John Law to the founding architecture of the United States.
Yes. Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, was a profound student of the British and French financial systems.
Right.
When the United States was formed, it was burdened by massive debts from the Revolutionary War. Hamilton deliberately imported this Anglo-French model. He consolidated the disparate debts of the individual states into a single national debt.
But he didn't view this debt as a temporary crisis to be paid off immediately, did he?
Not at all. He famously argued that a national debt, if not excessive, would actually be a national blessing.
Wait, how does owing people money become a blessing? What is the logic there?
Because Hamilton understood that sovereign debt acts as liquid capital for private banking. Government bonds give wealthy individuals and financial institutions a secure, interest-bearing asset to hold and trade.
So he linked the government to the rich?
He essentially intertwined the survival of the federal government with the wealth of the financial class. Because the United States was a brand new entity, it lacked an ancient, established aristocracy, and it didn't have 1,000-year-old imperial bureaucracy. Finance became the state.
The architectural core of the country was built completely around capital markets.
Consequently, wealth in the West became increasingly abstract. It focused on credit, derivatives, and equity valuations, rather than being strictly tied to underlying physical infrastructure or agricultural output.
Which brings us to the massive blind spot in modern Western analysis. Because the authors of these geopolitical papers repeatedly point out that we in the West try to view the entire globe through our specific 250-year-old lens. We look at other nations and evaluate them based on how closely their financial markets resemble ours. But the texts argue this is a category error. The United States is a young nation-state. It operates on a short-term, linear focus.
Very short term.
Right. Our political incentive structures are tied to 2 to 4 year election cycles, and our corporate incentive structures are tied to 90-day quarterly earnings reports. We prioritize immediate financial returns.
But when you look at nations like China and Russia, you absolutely cannot use that framework. They are not nation-states in the Western sense. They are civilization states.
This is perhaps the most crucial conceptual distinction in the entire deep dive. How do you define a civilization state?
A civilization state does not view its existence in fiscal quarters or election cycles. It views its history and its future in centuries and millennia.
That is a massive shift in perspective.
It is. Its core operating system is not driven by short-term financial engineering or maximizing shareholder value. It is driven by deep institutional trauma, civilizational memory, and profound survival mechanisms.
Let's really unpack that, starting with China. Because the sources describe China as operating on a deeply calculated trifusion system. What exactly are the three elements of this fusion?
China is a civilization state that merges three distinct traditions to ensure its longevity. The first layer, the foundational software of the society, is Confucianism.
Okay, the ancient philosophy.
Yes. This is a moral and ethical framework dating back over 2 millennia. It prioritizes relational duties, filial piety, collective harmony, and crucially, it views the state not as a necessary evil to be limited, but as a macro extension of the family unit.
So the leader has a moral obligation to provide for the people, and the people have a duty to maintain social cohesion.
Exactly.
Right. But moral software isn't enough to govern a massive, diverse empire on its own. You need enforcement. That's the second element, isn't it?
It is. The hardware of the system is legalism. This philosophy goes back to the Qin dynasty, the very first unification of China over 2,000 years ago.
And what does legalism entail?
Legalism operates on the assumption that human nature can be selfish and chaotic, and therefore it requires strict, impartial law enforcement and absolute state supremacy to maintain order. And this is deeply tied to the institutional trauma you mentioned earlier.
The concept of Luan.
Yes. The texts emphasize this concept of Luan, which roughly translates to chaos or profound disorder.
And from what I read, Luan is the ultimate nightmare scenario for the Chinese institutional memory.
It is the existential dread that dictates their entire policy. Throughout Chinese history, whenever the central authority became weak or fractured by internal factionalism, it didn't just lead to a minor economic recession.
Right. It wasn't just a dip in the stock market.
No, it led to warlordism, catastrophic civil wars, famine, foreign incursions, and literally the deaths of millions. The primary directive of the civilization state is to prevent Luan at all costs.
And the third element of the trifusion is much more recent, right? Marxism, Leninism.
Correct. Marxism-Leninism acts as the modern bureaucratic shell. It provides a highly disciplined, centralized organizational blueprint for the state apparatus.
That's in the management system.
Exactly. It allows the ruling party to mobilize vast resources and direct the economy towards strategic goals. So when Western analysts look at China, they often see a contradictory mix. They see them using capitalist market mechanisms to generate wealth, but they use a Leninist party apparatus to direct that wealth.
And the entire structure is underpinned by a 3,000-year-old Confucian focus on collective harmony and avoiding Luan.
Precisely. It's a highly integrated system, not a contradiction.
And if we pivot to Russia for a moment, they have an entirely different civilization-state matrix born from entirely different traumas.
Yes. Russia's institutional memory is defined by the trauma of existential geographic vulnerability. They reside on the vast, flat Eurasian steppe, severely lacking natural defensible borders.
Which has made them a target for centuries.
It has subjected them to centuries of devastating invasions, from the Mongols to Napoleon to Hitler in World War II. And more recently, their institutional memory is deeply scarred by the trauma of the 1990s.
The era of Western shock therapy.
Yes. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Western financial advisors urged rapid privatization and deregulation. The result, from the Russian perspective, was catastrophic Luan.
Total societal breakdown.
The economy completely collapsed, life expectancy plummeted, and a small group of oligarchs basically plundered the state's natural resources. Consequently, modern Russia's civilizational architecture is optimized for endurance under siege.
They have explicitly rejected the Huxleyan consumer model.
They have. Instead, they have built what analysts call a sovereign citadel.
What are the pillars of that citadel?
It is based on Eurasianism, the belief that Russia is a distinct world civilization that is neither purely European nor purely Asian with its own unique destiny. The economic policy is heavily focused on autarky, which means striving for total self-sufficiency in critical areas, particularly food production and energy.
And socially?
Socially, they rely heavily on traditionalism and orthodox religious values to maintain internal cohesion. They are structurally designed to tolerate severe economic friction and consumer deprivation in exchange for maintaining absolute geopolitical sovereignty.
So we have this profound contrast. The West chose the path of John Law, financializing the state, embracing abstract wealth, and integrating into a highly fragile global supply chain to survive.
Right.
Meanwhile, Russia and China explicitly rejected that financialized path in order to protect their sovereignty and prevent internal chaos.
But I want to really zero in on China here, because to truly understand why China has this deep, systemic distrust of allowing finance to capture the state, we have to look much further back than modern communism.
We do.
We have to look at a societal blueprint that is still acting as their civilizational software today. What is the Seaman, or the four occupations? The Seaman framework is absolutely essential to understanding modern Chinese statecraft. It is an ancient social hierarchy, codified over 2,000 years ago during the Zhou and Han dynasties.
And what makes it so fascinating to me is that it is a total precise inversion of the Western capitalist hierarchy.
It really is. In the modern West, the accumulation of capital traditionally translates directly into social prestige and political dominance. If you are the wealthiest person, you have the most influence over the state.
Yeah, just how the game is played here.
But the traditional Chinese hierarchy ranked the four classes of society not by how much wealth they accumulated, but by the tangible value they contributed to collective civilizational stability.
Let's break down the four tiers of this hierarchy, starting from the top. Who is at the apex?
At the very top of the social pyramid were the Shi. These were the scholars, the bureaucrats, the mandarins. These were the highly educated elite who passed rigorous imperial examinations to serve in the government.
But wait, they didn't produce any material wealth. They weren't building anything physical, and they weren't generating profits.
They didn't produce wealth, no, but they produced something far more valuable to a civilization state. They produced order,
Order over profit.
always. They designed and maintained the massive irrigation systems that prevented floods. They administered justice. They managed the emergency granaries. And they provided the intellectual cohesion that held a vast, disparate empire together. They represented the supremacy of the administrative state.
Okay, so that's the top. Moving down to the second tier, you have the Nong, the peasants, and the farmers.
The Nong were highly revered, structurally speaking. The philosophical concept was regarding agriculture as the root.
The literal root of society.
Yes. They were placed second only to the scholars because they engaged in the sacred act of producing the single most vital element for human survival, tangible food from the earth.
Without the labor of the Nong, the scholars starve, the military collapses, and the state descends into ruin.
Exactly. It's baseline survival.
Third on the list are the Gon, the artisans and craftsmen.
The Gong were respected because they used their skills to transform raw materials into useful material goods. They built the tools, the architecture, the weapons, and the physical infrastructure.
But they rank below the farmers.
Yes, because while a plow is necessary, many of the items artisans produced were luxury goods for the elite. And luxury goods were always considered secondary to baseline caloric survival.
And then we reach the bottom, the fourth tier, the absolute lowest rung of the social pyramid, the Shang, the merchants, the traders, the financiers.
Placed firmly and intentionally at the absolute bottom. The Shang were often wealthy, sometimes much wealthier than the Shi or even the emperor himself, but they were viewed with intense cultural suspicion.
They were subjected to sumptuary laws, right?
They were. They were forbidden from wearing silk, riding in chariots, or even taking the imperial examinations to gain political power.
Which, to a Western mind, sounds completely counterintuitive. I mean, in a capitalist society, the merchants are the job creators, the innovators, the engines of growth. Why was the Confucian system so structurally hostile to the very people generating economic activity?
Because the suspicion of the Shang was not just arbitrary prejudice. It was a highly sophisticated, calculated defense mechanism. The historical texts identify three specific reasons why the state felt compelled to subordinate the merchant class.
That's the first reason.
First is the concept of extraction without production. In the eyes of the ancient state, merchants did not grow wheat like the Nong, nor did they forge iron like the Gong. They simply bought commodities when they were cheap and sold them when they were dear.
They exploited arbitrage.
Exactly. Their wealth was viewed as parasitic extraction from the hard labor of others.
Okay, what is the second reason?
The second, and perhaps most critical, is the threat of mobile, borderless wealth. Think about it. A farmer's wealth is his land. He is physically tied to the stability of the local province. A bureaucrat's power is entirely dependent on the continuity of the state.
But a merchant, a financier.
Their wealth is liquid. If a famine hits or an invading army approaches, a wealthy merchant can hoard his silver, pack up his caravans, and simply flee across the border, leaving the local community to starve and collapse.
Capital is inherently flighty.
It has no loyalty to the soil, which makes it a massive national security risk for a state trying to maintain continuity.
And the third reason deals with the psychology of the society itself, doesn't it?
Yes, the distortion of societal incentives. The scholars argued that if the state celebrates financial speculation and elevates the merchant over the producer, human nature will simply follow the path of least resistance.
The brightest youth will abandon the grueling work of the agricultural fields and the engineering halls.
Exactly. And instead, they will flock to the cities to chase quick paper profits. The society will become hollow, frivolous, and entirely consumed by the pursuit of luxury, ultimately leading to civilizational rot.
I have to tell you, reading through these three critiques of the ancient Shang, I had a massive aha moment. because this 2,000-year-old fear perfectly describes the frustrations so many people have with the modern Western private equity model.
It is a striking parallel. How do you see the connection?
Think about the difference between the gong and the sheng in a modern context. Let's say you have a local contractor. He buys lumber, he pours concrete, he hires carpenters, and he builds an apartment building.
Okay, so he's producing value.
Right. He created a physical asset that provides shelter. He is a gong. Now, compare that to a massive, predatory private equity firm. They swoop in, they buy up an entire neighborhood using leveraged debt, they artificially inflate the rent, they strip the assets, they refuse to fix the plumbing, and then they flip the portfolio for a massive profit.
The exact definition of the Shang extraction.
Exactly. They extracted immense wealth from the community without producing any tangible value or improving the infrastructure. That is the exact thing the ancient Chinese scholars were terrified of.
And that is precisely the dynamic. The Chinese state recognized millennia ago that if unchecked commercial and financial power is allowed to aggregate, it will naturally seek to co-opt the political system. It will seek to dictate terms to the state to protect its own monopolies.
Okay, but it is one thing to have a moral philosophy from Confucius saying, merchants shouldn't have power. It is entirely another thing to operationalize that. How did this philosophy actually become hard law? How did the state weaponize this hierarchy against the merchants?
That transition from abstract philosophy to brutal statecraft is exactly what we need to examine next. Because Confucius provided the moral warning. He famously stated, "The noble person understands what is right. The small person understands what is profitable."
A great quote, but morality doesn't stop a ruthless tycoon.
It doesn't. It was a series of severe historical crises that forced the imperial state to develop economic countermeasures. The earliest and most prominent of these strategies is found in a text called the Guanzi, which dates back to around the 7th century BCE.
And the Guanzi introduced something called the light and heavy theory. How did that work?
The light and heavy theory is essentially an ancient blueprint for state-managed market stabilization. The authors of the Guanzi observed a recurring crisis. During years of bad harvests, wealthy merchants would use their massive capital reserves to buy up all the available grain in a region.
So they would corner the market.
They would hoard it, creating artificial scarcity, which drove the price of grain into the stratosphere. The peasants would literally starve, and the merchants would make astronomical profits. The Guanzi argued that the state absolutely cannot rely on the morality of the merchants.
So what's the solution?
Instead, the state must step in as the ultimate counterweight. The theory dictates that the state must build its own massive network of granaries. During years of abundant harvest, when grain is plentiful and cheap, the state aggressively buys up the surplus.
Okay.
Then, when a famine hits and the merchants attempt to hoard grain to drive up the price, the state simply opens its granaries and floods the market with cheap grain.
Wow. The price instantly crashes, the people are fed, and the speculative merchants are financially ruined.
The state uses market mechanisms to crush the manipulators.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. To use a modern analogy, it's like what happened during the early days of the pandemic with toilet paper.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
You had individuals going to stores, buying up every single roll of toilet paper, and then trying to sell it online for $50 a pack. They were exploiting a crisis. The light and heavy theory would be the government stepping in, opening a massive warehouse of state-owned toilet paper, selling it for $1, and bankrupting the hoarders instantly.
Exactly. The state leverages its immense scale to protect the populace from predatory arbitrage. But the true breaking point, the moment where the state permanently codified its hostility toward independent capital, occurred centuries later, during the Han Dynasty.
This is known as the Crisis of 154 BCE, right? The Rebellion of the Seven States.
Yes.
Walk us through the mechanics of that rebellion, because this is the moment that really seems to cement their institutional memory.
At this time, the Han Emperor was attempting to centralize authority and strip power away from regional kings and princes. In response, 7 of these powerful regional states launched a massive, coordinated military rebellion against the imperial throne.
An existential threat to the state.
The emperor's government was caught completely off guard. They desperately needed funds to raise an army, outfit soldiers, and sustain a massive military campaign. So the imperial court went to the wealthiest merchant tycoons and moneylenders in the capital city, Chang'an, and asked for emergency loans to fund the war effort.
And these merchants, living under the protection of the emperor, what did they do?
They looked at the geopolitical situation, calculated the odds of the emperor winning, decided it was too risky, and they flatly refused to lend the money.
Unbelievable.
Or, if they did offer, they demanded astronomical interest rates, sometimes up to 1,000%. That would have effectively bankrupted the state anyway.
So, in the middle of an existential civil war, the private financial class looks at the state and basically says, sorry, the ROI just isn't there for us.
Precisely. The emperor eventually managed to secure funding from one obscure aristocrat, crushed the rebellion, and survived. But the psychological shock to the Han court was permanent.
They realized the true danger of the Shang.
The merchants had proven that an independent, wealthy financial class is not just a moral nuisance, it is an existential national security threat. If a small group of private individuals controls the money supply, they hold a de facto veto power over the survival of the state itself.
They realized that if capital is independent, capital is king.
Exactly. Which leads directly to one of the most famous policy debates in ancient history, the discourse on salt and iron, which took place in 81 BCE.
What happened there?
Following decades of continuous border wars against nomadic tribes, the Han treasury was completely depleted. The state needed massive revenue. But instead of borrowing from the merchants again, the state executed a ruthless maneuver. They nationalized the production and distribution of salt and iron.
Why those two specific commodities?
Because they were the absolute bottlenecks of ancient civilization. Salt is biologically essential for human nutrition and food preservation. You can't live without it.
And iron.
Iron is essential for forging agricultural plows and military weapons. If private speculators are allowed to monopolize salt and iron, they can literally hold the entire populace hostage to their pricing whims.
So by taking them over.
By nationalizing these industries, the Han state achieved two critical goals simultaneously. They generated immense reliable revenue for the military, and they permanently broke the back of the merchant class, preventing them from ever accumulating enough capital to challenge the imperial throne.
The contrast here with the Western model is absolutely staggering to me. When the Western European states faced bankruptcy, they executed a John Law debt-to-equity swap. They allowed private capital to capture the state apparatus to fund their wars.
Right. They merged with capital.
But China's institutional memory dictated the exact opposite reaction. Capital must be aggressively captured by the state. The profits from vital civilizational resources must go into the public treasury to build infrastructure, not into the private coffers of oligarchs.
And that institutional memory is not confined to antiquity. It is the exact same architectural DNA driving their policies today.
So let's pull this 2,000-year-old history directly into the modern headlines. How does this ancient suspicion of the Shang manifest in modern macroeconomic policy?
To explore this, our sources bring in the work of economist Clara Mattei, specifically her book Escape from Capitalism, and her concept of the austerity trinity.
Mattei's analysis is a profound critique of how the Western state interacts with capital. When we hear the word austerity in the West, politicians usually frame it as a painful but necessary household budgeting exercise, right?
Right. We spent too much, now we have to tighten our belts.
Mattei argues this is a deliberate misdirection. She posits that austerity is not an economic necessity, it is a political weapon.
A weapon against who?
It is a class project deployed by the state specifically to protect the core pillars of capitalism, the necessity of wage labor and the unquestioned right of private capital to command investment. She breaks this weapon down into three distinct prongs: fiscal, monetary, and industrial austerity.
Let's explain the mechanics of each one, starting with fiscal.
Fiscal austerity is what we typically see in the headlines. It involves the state aggressively slashing public spending, cutting funding for public health care, education, welfare programs, and infrastructure.
But crucially, it is coupled with regressive taxation. The state cuts taxes for corporations and the wealthy, while shifting the tax burden onto consumers through sales taxes or VAT.
The mechanism here is a direct upward transfer of wealth. By defunding public resources, the state forces the working class into a position of precarity, ensuring they have absolutely no choice but to accept whatever wages the private market offers simply to survive.
And what about monetary austerity? How does a central bank weaponize policy?
Monetary austerity is executed primarily through interest rates. When workers start demanding higher wages, or when inflation threatens the value of financial assets held by the wealthy, the central bank intervenes. They drastically raise interest rates.
The mathematical mechanism here is deliberate. Higher borrowing costs force companies to shrink, which intentionally induces unemployment.
By increasing the pool of desperate unemployed workers, the central bank deliberately crushes the bargaining power of labor. The system will gladly accept a recession if it means disciplining the workforce and protecting the value of capital.
And the final prong is industrial austerity.
Industrial austerity involves the systemic deregulation of the labor market. This means dismantling unions, removing worker protections, and legalizing precarious gig economy structures. It is the dismantling of any institutional leverage the worker has against the employer.
So when you synthesize Matei's austerity trinity, the conclusion is pretty grim. In the Western model, when a crisis hits, the state's primary function is to serve the capital class. It bails out the banking sector while simultaneously enforcing precarity and discipline on the working class.
The Shang are firmly in control of the state apparatus.
That is the Western dynamic. But Matei points out that China manages to escape this specific capitalist austerity trap through a vital structural mechanism: strict capital controls.
Let's explain how capital controls actually function in practice, because this is where the ancient system really reemerges.
In a purely open financialized economy, capital is completely fluid. If a billionaire doesn't like the tax policies in his home country, he simply liquidates his assets, wires the funds to a tax haven, or parks his wealth in London real estate. He uses the threat of capital flight to force the government to deregulate.
Exactly. Capital controls neutralize this threat entirely. The Chinese state strictly limits the amount of currency that can be moved out of the country. A billionaire cannot simply move his fortune offshore.
The wealth generated within the borders of the civilization state is trapped within the borders of the civilization state,
Which completely severs the political leverage of the wealthy class. And this brings us to a massive synthesis in our reading. The modern Communist Party of China is essentially acting as the modern iteration of the ancient Xi class.
the mandarins.
That is the exact parallel these strategists draw. The bureaucratic apparatus of the modern state is fulfilling the historical role of the Xi. They are asserting administrative order over the merchant class.
And when you view it through that lens, recent global financial news makes so much more sense. A few years ago, Jack Ma, one of China's most famous tech billionaires, was about to launch the largest initial public offering in history for his fintech company, Ant Group.
It was going to be a massive financialization event. And right before it happened, the state stepped in and crushed the IPO. Jack Ma largely disappeared from public view.
And how did Western analysts interpret that event at the time?
Western analysts, using their broken X-ray machine, called it irrational authoritarianism. They said the Chinese state was paranoid, that they were shooting themselves in the foot by destroying the free market and crushing their most successful entrepreneur.
But when you apply the lens of the seaman, it wasn't irrational at all. It was the civilization state asserting its deepest survival programming. Ant Group was heavily involved in highly leveraged consumer microlending,
They were acting as a massive shadow bank.
generating immense systemic financial risk, but socializing that risk onto the public while privatizing the profits. The modern Xi class looked at this dynamic and recognized the ancient threat of the Shang.
The Luan was brewing.
Exactly. They stepped in to discipline capital. They were actively reminding the billionaires that they are permitted to accumulate wealth, but they will never be allowed to command the state or dictate national policy.
We see the exact same mechanism with their real estate sector. The government instituted the policy of housing is for living in, not for speculation. They deliberately popped their own massive, over-leveraged real estate bubble, allowing massive developers to default.
In the West, a real estate collapse of that magnitude would result in massive government bailouts to protect the financial sector, like we saw in 2008.
But the Chinese state refused to bail out the speculators. They protected the individual home buyers who had paid for unbuilt apartments, but they let the financial engineering collapse. Capital is viewed as a utility to serve national development. It is not the ruler.
It is the systemic anchor that ensures the capitalist class never achieves hegemony over the government.
Okay, I have to push back here. Because while this strict control sounds great for maintaining stability and preventing oligarchs from taking over, there is an obvious downside.
The innovation problem?
Yes. If you constantly suppress the merchant class, if you always keep a heavy lid on your billionaires and financial innovators, don't you inevitably kill innovation?
Let's be completely honest. The West's pursuit of profit, its venture capital markets, its sheer, unadulterated greed, that is what built the iPhone.
It is.
That is what built the modern internet. It drives disruptive, high-risk, high-reward technological leaps. How does a tightly controlled civilization state compete in the rapidly evolving 21st century without completely losing its innovative edge?
That is the precise dilemma that the Chinese leadership has wrestled with. And it brings us to the structural transition discussed in the final sections of our material, updating the matrix.
They know this is a weakness.
The leadership is acutely aware of this historical weakness. Historically, the imperial state preferred continuity over disruption, which accidentally suppressed the raw incentive structures necessary for rapid technological progress. They missed the Industrial Revolution because they were too focused on internal stability.
So how do they fix it now? They recognize that to survive competition with the West today, they cannot simply crush all commerce. They have had to execute a massive civilizational pivot. They are actively redefining the four occupations for the modern era.
They are redefining the Shang.
Exactly. They have effectively split the modern Shang class into two entirely distinct categories. On one side, you have the financial speculators. These are the shadow banking operators, the cryptocurrency miners, the predatory real estate tycoons, the consumer lending platforms.
The extractor.
Yes, these entities are heavily regulated, suppressed, and marginalized. They are viewed as the ancient Shang, entities that manipulate prices and extract wealth without producing tangible civilizational value.
But on the other side?
On the other side, you have the productive innovators. These are the software engineers, the founders of semiconductor fabrication firms, the pioneers in artificial intelligence, the builders of electric vehicle supply chains.
And how are they treated?
These individuals are not suppressed. They are celebrated. They are heavily subsidized by the state, granted massive resources, and elevated in social status.
They are essentially treated as high-level gong.
Yes. They are viewed as industrial artisans who use market mechanisms and entrepreneurial drive to achieve national self-reliance and technological sovereignty.
It's a model of state-directed innovation. In the West, innovation is entirely driven by venture capital seeking massive, short-term financial returns. This gives us incredible software apps and addictive social media platforms. But it leaves our physical infrastructure, our bridges, our power grids, our manufacturing base completely hollowed out.
Because fixing a bridge doesn't yield a 10x return in 18 months.
China reverses that vector.
Mm-hmm.
The Xi determines the strategic goals based on civilizational survival. They say, we need quantum computing, we need biotech, we need green energy dominance. Then they unleash the entrepreneurial class to innovate fiercely within those predefined boundaries.
But the unwritten rule remains. The moment a tech billionaire attempts to pivot from technological innovation to political power, the leash snaps tight instantly.
And the sources emphasize that this bifurcated approach is not accidental. It is highly intentional, deeply studied strategy. If we look at the writings of Wang Huning, who is considered the preeminent ideological architect behind China's grand strategy over the last 3 decades, his insights are profound.
In 1991, he wrote a book called America Against America after spending months traveling extensively throughout the United States, studying its political and social structures.
And what did he conclude back in 1991?
He essentially diagnosed the exact Huxley-Orwell hybrid dystopia we discussed at the beginning of this deep dive. Long before social media existed, Wang predicted that Western hyper-individualism, coupled with pure, unconstrained financialization, would inevitably dissolve the social fabric of the nation.
He saw the math breaking decades before the debt hit $38 trillion.
He argued that an economy based entirely on consumer gratification and abstract financial derivatives would leave the population spiritually hollowed out, deeply alienated, and ultimately lead to a systemic, paralyzing domestic crisis.
He realized that the United States was a tremendously efficient economic engine, but one that was structurally vulnerable to its own profit motives.
The texts note that the Central Party School in Beijing explicitly studies Western financial crises, like the 2008 subprime mortgage meltdown, in forensic detail.
What are they looking for?
Their entire goal is to figure out how to acquire Western technological and economic power without infecting their own civilization with the same virus of financial atomization. They are intentionally deflating their own speculative bubbles before those bubbles become too big to fail and capture the state.
Which brings us to the ultimate overarching stress test of this entire deep dive. We have these two fundamentally opposed architectures. We have the hyper-financialized Western model running on a debt treadmill and digital distraction. And we have the civilization states, rooted in deep institutional memory and physical sovereignty.
Right.
What happens to these different systems if the global contagion actually hits? If the U.S. debt wall finally breaks, causing a complete global economic collapse.
The structural blueprints suggest radically different outcomes. If global credit markets freeze overnight and international just-in-time supply chains paralyze, societies that are completely reliant on abstract financial instruments and imported physical goods will face immediate, cascading chaos.
When fiat currency loses its credibility, you cannot eat a derivative contract.
But the civilization states have engineered their architecture specifically for this exact nightmare scenario.
They have built an ark.
They've built an ark. China's architecture functions as a heavily armored vessel designed to survive the storm of Luton. They have prioritized food autarky, maintaining massive strategic grain reserves, recognizing the non-agriculture as the absolute root of survival.
And they have prioritized industrial sovereignty, the gong.
They maintain a completely unified, self-contained industrial supply chain within their borders. If global maritime trade stops tomorrow, they still possess the raw manufacturing capacity to produce their own energy grids, their own medical equipment, and their own defense systems.
And this reframes their entire foreign policy, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative. Western analysts often look at the Belt and Road and try to calculate the financial return on investment. They point out that China is lending money to developing nations that might default, and they call it a massive failure.
But through the lens of physical survival, it's not about interest rates.
Not at all. It is about accumulating physical assets. Through these initiatives, they have secured deep water ports in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, physical rail networks stretching across Central Asia to bypass vulnerable maritime choke points, and long-term extraction rights for critical rare earth minerals in Africa.
When paper fiat money evaporates, wealth defaults back to hard commodities and physical infrastructure. Furthermore, because the central state does not have to negotiate with the paralyzed private capital class or worry about quarterly shareholder value, they possess absolute real-time adaptation.
In a true crisis, the Xi can instantly reallocate labor, seize production, and enforce price controls to ensure collective civilizational continuity.
They can just flip the switch.
Wow. We have covered a truly massive journey today. We started by diagnosing the hybrid dystopian cage of the modern West, the synthesis of surveillance capitalism, and the digital soma dopamine loop, rooted all the way back in John Law's Paper Alchemy and Alexander Hamilton's financialized statecraft.
And we followed that thread to the deep-time civilizational memories of Russia's sovereign citadel and China's ancient four occupations.
What we are witnessing is not just a trade war or a political squabble. It is a monumental structural clash. It is a battle between short-term financialization and long-term physical survival.
It is an existential architectural battle. The West built the most powerful, dynamic economic engine in human history, but it was constructed entirely on the assumption of infinite growth, permanent global stability, and the supremacy of highly mobile capital.
The East assumes instability, prioritizes continuity, and subordinates capital to the state.
And to you, listening right now, I think the biggest takeaway from all of this material is this. The everyday models we are taught to use to understand the world, the simple binaries of capitalism versus communism, democracy versus autocracy, they are often just one specific narrow set of lenses.
True understanding requires looking beneath the 24-hour media noise. It requires discarding the broken X-ray machine and examining the architectural DNA, the institutional traumas, and the deep civilizational memories of the players making moves on the global chessboard.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. As global supply chains continue to visibly fracture and as fiat currencies increasingly wobble under the weight of historic mathematically unpayable debt, take a moment to look around your immediate environment.
What are you actually holding?
Ask yourself, when the digital soma wears off, when the screens go dark and the financial abstractions evaporate, what physical, tangible assets does your civilization actually own?
Because when the geopolitical X-ray machine is broken, you cannot rely on the old diagnoses anymore. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it helped clarify the murky waters. Keep questioning the matrix around you, keep looking for the deep structures beneath the surface, and we will see you next time on The Deep Dive.